As you've seen, it was another day packed with testimony and talking in the hours-long public impeachment hearing today. NBC's Jane Timm is here now to separate the fact from the fiction in all of this. Jane, is there one thing in particular you want to clear up for our audience, something that was mentioned in today's hearing that's just not sitting well with you?
You know, the big one, I think, was that this was a personnel issue, that this was just somebody who got fired. And I think Devin Nunes said this should be in a personnel committee in the House, Foreign Service or some other committee. But this isn't just a personnel issue. Ambassadors can get fired, but this appears to be part of a larger trend, a larger sort of back-channel diplomacy that was going on and being led by the president's personal attorney that ousted an ambassador. And it's a larger issue here. So the idea that this is just sort of someone who was fired just doesn't really make sense. There's a lot more going on here. And I think that we talked a lot about, in his hearing, we kept hearing about her record and how she's done this for a long time. And you saw Republicans sort of seek to make the idea that, well, you still have a job and you're still paid by the State Department and your compensation hasn't changed. And she goes, but I didn't expect to see my career ended by a smear campaign targeted against me, that unfounded rumors, that I lost my job over something I didn't do, and unceremoniously get the next plane home, kind of lose your job.
After 33 years, no less.
After 33 years as a career, nonpartisan civil servant.
A big Republican talking point is that all witness information that we're hearing so far is hearsay. You've suggested, though, in your reporting that things are a little bit more complicated than that. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday, the idea that these are people whose job it is to know what's going on. And while this ambassador was removed before some of the activities that we've been talking about and some of the conversations, the White House has also made a huge effort to stop people who might have firsthand information that would be brought up in this from testifying. So the White House has essentially ordered people in the executive branch to just, you have immunity, you don't have to testify, you don't have to listen to the subpoena. Just a few of them: Mick Mulvaney, acting chief of staff; Robert Blair, his top aide and assistant to the president; John Eisenberg, a lawyer who was reported a lot of these issues too; Michael Ellis, Brian McCormick, Michael Duffy, Wells Griffith, a whole long list of people who were involved in these conversations and have been barred from talking to the committee. So when you say, these are all hearsay, but you're blocking the people who maybe might have more information or firsthand information or were in all the conversations we're talking about, it comes to beg the question, well, why can't they talk if there's something wrong?
Let me ask you this, Jane. President Trump got flack for witness tampering after a tweet directed at Yovanovitch that we've been talking about a whole lot today. He says, though, he's got the right to speak. Do these things go hand in hand?
Yeah, he said, I have freedom of speech just like everybody else. But freedom of speech has limits, as we all know. I can yell fire. In many instances, I cannot yell it in a crowded theater or, say, an airplane where it would create a public safety hazard. Like anything, freedom of speech has limits, and witness tampering is one of those things that you can't do. You can say a lot of things. You cannot tamper with a witness. Whether or not, I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not going to go into whether or not this amounts to it, but you heard the former ambassador saying this was very intimidating. And you could see that it was just having to have her react in real time to a tweet. I mean, we all read the president's often mean tweets, but to react in real time, you could tell that had an effect. This is someone who's worked for her government for a long time and sort of is in many ways, is a victim of a larger thing that's going on and not about her.
We heard mention of potential Ukraine interference, and the ambassador again and again stated that Russia was the one that interfered in the 2016 election. What's going on here? Why do we keep hearing about this?
This is sort of confounding. Russia meddled in the 2016 election. Everybody agrees on that, apparently, except people who want to kind of make this Ukraine story more okay. So this is sort of what Giuliani was getting at when he was going to Ukraine and trying to talk to other people and sort of find the source of the Mueller report is what he openly said. The source of the Mueller report is attempted meddling in the U.S. election by Russia. Ukraine is not the source here. So this sort of alternative narrative that's being pushed is in defense of the president's actions in Ukraine and the president's attorney's actions in Ukraine. But I think that we need to just be super, super clear. Russia meddled. It's not about Ukraine. These are different places. Even if Russia would like Ukraine to be part of Russia.
Jane Timm, thanks so much for being with us today. We always appreciate it.
Thanks, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.